Hello, this video is going to cover the social issues of the Gilded Age. Remember, we're in period 6, 1865 to 1898, but we're also going to add a little bit from period 7 because you can't really talk about the problems without talking about the responses that people have to these problems. And so we're going to also look at the Progressive Era reformers from 1900 to 1920 that relate specifically to the social issues being discussed. And this is a time period of an immense growth in urbanization, as you can see here from this picture of New York City in the early 1900s. There's a massive amount of people there. You have new modes of transportation, you have skyscrapers that are seen. We're going to talk all about the challenges and the issues related to this. With this massive urbanization, in 1850, just 15% of Americans lived in cities. But by 1900, that's 40% of Americans living in cities. And by 1920, it's going to be the fact that more Americans will live in cities than they will in rural areas. And one of the important things to understand here is the definition of a city was just 2,500 people. So much different than these massive cities that we're going to really talk about here, what is considered an urban area. And part of this growth is due to the fact that there are people moving from farming areas, rural areas into the cities, but also that you have a massive wave of immigration and immigrants are entering into port cities like Boston and New York and not moving elsewhere. With this, we are going to have a lot of innovations that are going to allow for the expansion of cities. This includes bridges, skyscrapers, modern conveniences such as trolley lines, railway cars, subways, and things like that. It's going to start with urban business districts and spread out from there into more suburban type areas. On the left-hand side, you see a picture of a skyscraper, and at the bottom right-hand corner, you see a trolley. And trolley lines, as well as elevated rail lines, are going to help in major cities, including San Francisco. You can still go and ride the cable car, but also you can ride the F car, which is an example of an early rail line that was in these cities. About two-thirds of all immigrants will settle in the cities such as New York City, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, and they're going to live in ethnic neighborhoods called enclaves. And these enclaves will provide them a sense of community, security, where people speak the same language, they eat the same food, they have similar customs. And the picture that you see is of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that is known as Klein Deutschland at the time. And that's known that way because there are such a huge German population that live there. In fact, the largest German population outside of Germany are going to live there at the time. And so we still, to this day, see enclaves as immigrants that come to this country wish to settle with other immigrants from their similar backgrounds. And we can see examples of this all over the United States with places like Little Saigon that we have here in Orange County in California. We have Chinatowns in many different places. We have Little Tokyo and Little Italy and places like that. These individuals came and settled in these urban areas. And on the right-hand side, the map can show you examples of enclaves. And you see Hungarians, Romanians, Polish, Middle Eastern and Romanian, as well as Russian. And these all also happen to be Jewish enclaves as well. And so it was just more comfortable to settle in areas where other people could speak the language and therefore help you succeed. With the cities, they were not really prepared for such rapid population growth. And so most urban immigrants are going to live in tenements. And that's an important term to know. And that's why I underlined it and bolded it. And these are low rent apartments that are in the poorest parts of town. And I'm going to talk about them for a few minutes here. And many urban poor develop lung disease and tuberculosis. About 60% of immigrant babies die before their first birthday. And you can see on the right that that building is, that roof looks like it's about to collapse. And there were no safety standards at that time to ensure that a roof like that, a building that was about to collapse, was going to be taken seriously. In fact, the time period of this, there was going to be stairs that would be broken and it'd need a repair. Pipes would freeze and burst in the winter, and for days, tenants would have no water to drink. And if winter brought intense cold and broken pipes, then summer brought its own kind of misery. Sometimes, to escape the heat and smells of their rooms, families would pick up their bedding and search for other places to sleep. They could be seen wandering the streets at all hours of the night. Some made their way to parks, others sought relief on the docks. Most, however, slept on the roofs of their tenement buildings. When it rained, they grabbed their blankets and dashed back to their rooms. But there were always a few too tired and too miserable to care, and they just stayed out in the rain. This is what a dumbbell tenement looks like. And you can see that there are four buildings, four apartments on each level, and only one side has a fire escape. Really, this one happens to have two, but most of the ones didn't have fire escapes on both sides. And so getting ventilation in was difficult because you'd only have one side of your house that was ventilated, and so getting things to cross draft was hard unless you wanted to open your lives to everybody else on your floor. And these were really tiny living rooms and bedrooms and everything. This one happens to, on the left, show two bedrooms. The one that I have visited, which is part of the Tenement Museum in New York, and I have a separate video I will do on that, the that had just one little living room, parlor, and a kitchen type area, a parlor, and a bedroom. The bedroom was the smallest of all of them. And so you can see here at the top a picture also where there was several different men, it looks like, sleeping on the floor. There's some up on the boards up on top if you look at the left hand corner. Um, and this was a place to sleep, really, for individuals. There wasn't a lot of ventilation. It was very overcrowded. You might have multiple families living in one single apartment. There's not going to be, particularly in New York City. The one I visited was built in the 1860s, and it does not have any kind of indoor plumbing until the early 1900s. And so this is just a miserable existence. But you have to keep in mind it possibly was better existence than previously had been seen. So, talking about some of the reformers, how are they going to deal with this? Well, one of the individuals was named Jacob Riis. He wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives to expose the urban poverty and life in the slums. And he also took pictures. And I'm going to read to you an excerpt from How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. Be a little careful, please. The hall is dark and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Picks and cuffs are their daily diet. They have little else. Here, where the hall turns and dives into utter darkness, is a step, and another and another. A flight of stairs. You can feel your way if you cannot see it. Close? Yes. What would you have? All the fresh air that enters these stairs comes from the hall door that is forever slamming, and from the windows of dark bedrooms that in turn receive from the stairs their sole supply of the elements God meant to be free. The man deals out with such stingy hand. That was a woman filling her pail by the hydrant you just bumped against. The sinks are in the hallway that all the tenants may have access, and all be poisoned alike by the summer stenches. Hear the pump squeak. It is the lullaby of tenement house babes. In summer, when 1,000 thirsty throats pant for a cooling drink in this block, it is worked in vain. But the saloon, whose open door you passed in the hall, is always there. The smell of it has followed you up. Here is a door. Listen. That short hacking cough, the tiny helpless wail, what do they mean? They mean that the soiled bow of white you saw on the door downstairs will have another story to tell. Oh, a sadly familiar story. Before the day is at end, the child is dying of measles. With half a chance, it might have lived, but it had none. The dark bedroom killed it. And so, by describing this kind of a scene and by showing images such as this that you see here, Jacob Riis hoped to reach those individuals who maybe had heard that life was pretty bad and were saying, oh, well, it's too bad for them. But instead, he hoped to bring it into their home through printed word and image so that maybe they would feel some kind of a guilt, perhaps, and want to do something to help. He was hoping to motivate them based on their emotions. And another woman that goes about doing progressive reforms is Jane Addams, and she created Whole House in Chicago. She got the idea for settlement houses after visiting one in Europe, and her efforts inspired other reformers in other cities to build similar houses that assisted the poor. Whole House was the first settlement house. It offered baths, inexpensive food, childcare, job training, healthcare, and so much more to help the poor. And it could even be a place like a community center where people could have wedding receptions and do different things. And so, one of the ways that they tried to really help was that. And progressive reformers, I will talk about in another video when we get to period 7 in particular. They're working in a number of different areas. It's not a unified movement. It's individuals like Jane Addams who see a need and decide to work through it that become known together as progressives, but not an organized movement. In the 1880s, many middle class Protestant Christians also embraced what's called the social gospel movement that is going to help reform society. And so that's one of the other ways that they're going to assist, as well as the YMCA, which initially stood for the Young Men's Christian Association, that they created gyms and libraries to help young men. at the time, and now obviously it helps a lot more than just young men. Um, and it's not just religious. There's places, swimming lessons and all kinds of things, after school programs for kids. The Salvation Army is also something. They actually had existed since 1865 and been around since the Civil War, but they become increasingly active during this time period of the Gilded Age, and are going to create nurseries and soup kitchens, and they're going to try to help people, and they still exist today as well. Another area of need of reform that we've previously talked about was the idea of alcohol. And we are familiar previously with the temperance reforms, that they thought that they could reduce corruption and crime, and maybe that they could draw more immigrants in. And you had reformers such as Frances Willard and Carrie Nation lead what's called the Women's Christian Temperance Union to fight for prohibition laws. And Carrie Nation was an interesting woman. Here you see her holding a Bible and a hatchet, and she actually is known for taking a hatchet to bars and to saloons and destroying them. And so she's a little bit more radical than many of the temperance workers, but she certainly had her ways of working on it. And there was a lot of voting as far as wet or dry. And it will be at the tail end of the progressive era that we will see the 18th Amendment brought in. And we will talk a lot more about prohibition once we get to the 1920s as well. So some of this is going to overlap here, and you'll see it again. But reformers gained prohibition laws in rural areas and states in the South and West, and eventually it spread to the entire country, and it will last from 1920 to 1933. Another area of progressive reform included women's rights, and women were denied equal rights Um, in most states, married women were not able to divorce or own property, and women could not vote, but Black, immigrant, and illiterate men could, and they saw this as wrong. And women were paid less than men, and they were expected to remain at home and be housewives and mothers. So they sought more opportunities and more rights for themselves. It did bring about some more opportunities. Particularly, some women were able to live more independently in cities as secretaries, store clerks, and telephone operators. This is especially going to be true once we get into the 1900s. More women will graduate from high school and attend universities. And here you have women in the graduating class of Oberlin College in 1898. And it's important to note that Oberlin is also going to be one of the first universities to admit African Americans. And then on the right, you see Vassar, which is a women's college that was created during the time period too. During the progressive era, many women are going to take the leads as important roles as reformers, just like they did during the antebellum time period. So we already mentioned Jane Addams. There'll be a muckraker, which I'll explain that in a different video. Ida Tarbell, she's going to go after corporate monopolies. Carrie Nation, as I mentioned. Florence Kelley will help end child labor. And so women are taking on these roles as reformers, just like they were doing in the 1800s, and saying, but we still don't have the right to vote. And so that's going to lead them into that in just a minute. We'll talk about that. Women are also going to gain laws that ban prohibition. Margaret Sanger is very important for birth control. Now, it's not nearly as widely used as it will be starting in the 1960s when it becomes more acceptable. But the first birth control clinic in the United States opened in 1915, and she helped to create an organization that allowed like free clinics for women, or low cost clinics, so that poor individuals had the same access to healthcare as the wealthier women counterparts. So the most significant reform obviously is going to be women's rights to vote. Women had demanded these property rights and voting rights in 1848 at Seneca Falls, which we previously talked about. They were very frustrated after the Civil War granted Black men the right to vote, but women still couldn't vote. In fact, it's going to be another 50 years before women get the right to vote after that the 15th Amendment is passed. In 1890, you'll see the formation of a new organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Women will march for the right to vote. Women will stand out in front of the White House, and I will share this story more later. The yellow rose signifies women's suffrage, and that's why they're included there at the bottom. In the early 1900s, most Western states will allow women to vote, even though women in the East cannot. And finally, in 1920, the states will ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. The progressive era is also going to lead to demands for African American rights. 80% of African Americans lived in rural areas in the South, mostly as sharecroppers, which I talked about in the Reconstruction time period. There are barriers to them actually being able to vote, including literacy tests and poll taxes, which will limit their rights to vote. Jim Crow laws will be in full force with segregation of schools, hotels, restaurants, trains, and other public facilities. And in fact, there's a very important court case that you need to know called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And Homer Plessy was 7/8 white. However, he had that one little eighth that was black, and he decided to get onto a regular train car, and he was arrested. And he claimed that his rights were violated under the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court disagreed with him. And the reason this case is super important is because it legalizes segregation in the United States. And it will say that there's a very important three words I want you to know and write down, and that is separate but equal. And the court said, as long as you have two separate ones, then that's okay. You can't have an only white school and not allow blacks to attend. You can have an all white school if you also have an all black school. And that is how the Plessy versus Ferguson case established it all the way up until 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education decision that we will get to later on. So again, very important, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, legalizes segregation. Additionally, Black individuals had to deal with a lot with lynching and other forms of violence during this time period. There are two different civil rights leaders that are important to know, plus another individual who's going to have a different approach. So let's start with Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave in Virginia, and he himself became educated, became a teacher after the Civil War. He is the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which you see pictured below, two images from that is today known as Tuskegee University. And it started out as a school to train Black workers and teachers. And he really looked at it from the point of view of, you know what? It's okay if we have segregation right now. It's okay if we're not demanding our rights. Let's focus on ourselves. Let's work hard. Let's get the education. And then white people will see that they have to give us, that we are their equals and they have to give us our rights. And so he saw it as, let's worry about education first, rights later. And that was the way he wanted to go about it. And he says here in the Atlanta Compromise, our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands and fail to keep our mind that we shall prosper as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor. It is at the bottom of life we should begin and not the top. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So again, saying it's okay if we need to start at the beginning, we can't start at the top. We need to, it's okay if we're segregated, but let's focus on the essential things, which includes work and the opportunity to an education. In contrast to him, W.B. Du Bois, who was born in Massachusetts, he's the first Black man to earn a doctorate from Harvard, so he's extremely well educated. He also thinks that education is important, but he says we cannot wait on our rights. We must have civil rights now. And so he says we claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free American, political, civil, and social. And until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of Americans. So while Booker T. Washington says education first, civil rights later, Du Bois says education and civil rights now, that we must have our civil rights now. We can't wait on this. And in 1905, Du Bois and some other Black leaders are going to create the Niagara Movement. They're going to demand an end to segregation, discrimination, economic, and educational equality. And their meeting is going to lead to the formation of a very important group that still exists today, which is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Most people say NAACP and not write out the entire words for it. But it was established in 1909 to fight for Black equality, and they fought against voting restrictions, segregation laws by using the 14th Amendment to file lawsuits, and they are still fighting today on behalf of colored individuals for equal rights. The other person I wanted to mention was a Jamaican immigrant by the name of Marcus Garvey, and he believed that there was no possible way for whites and Black people to coexist in America. So in 1907, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, that was focusing on Black improvement. But also, he establishes the idea of a Back to Africa movement, encouraging Black people to return to Africa. And this is not the first time that this has been come up as an idea. There was also the idea during the Civil War of the nation of Liberia that was purchased by Americans as a way to move people back to Africa. This one will fail because not many people are going to go, because most people say, I've lived here my whole life. I don't know anything about Africa. Why would I want to go? I'd rather stay here. He does, however, create a number of businesses promoting Black nationalism, and some of his ideas are going to be borrowed upon by another famous African American by the name of Malcolm X, who is initially going to talk about this idea that Blacks and whites can't coexist. Garvey will lose credibility. He will be put in jail for mail fraud and eventually deported back to Jamaica, but he still does have a great impact upon the African American community. So, looking at the idea that while women are gaining voting rights and labor laws, African Americans are unable to end Jim Crow segregation. In fact, like I said, it's going to be all the way until the 1950s and even into the 1960s that they're going to be able to see any real changes happening, um, including stopping lynching or gaining economic equality. But that doesn't stop them. And in fact, these three men are very influential in the future civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 60s. And that is where we will end for our social issues video. Thank you very much.